Hello. So in this video, I'm going to do a revision to topic one of Edexcel A-level history, civil rights in the USA, 1850 to 2009. I'm going to talk through key content briefly, give a kind of overview of how to break down the content, and then go through the past questions that there have been on this topic. Okay, so to begin with, starting with the specification, it's broken into three sections. So this is topic one, Reconstruction 1865 to 77. And it's broken down into these three areas. So the 13th Amendment, so reasons for and the importance of the passage of the 13th Amendment, radical Reconstruction, and the backlash. So I'm going to go into each of these, and this is how you should kind of structure your revision around those key bullet points. So in terms of a timeline, what happens here? So in terms of the big picture, what happens is it's the end of the US Civil War, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified, which means the abolition of slavery, the institution of slavery in the USA. So Black Americans are freed by the 13th Amendment, and it's the subsequent kind of government legislation and details of how those Black Americans are treated and the rights that they have is really the story of this topic. So the end of the Civil War, 13th Amendment, immediately you have the KKK being established, which really highlights just the kind of white backlash in the South immediately to the newly freed Black Americans, who at this point, their legal status is somewhat kind of in limbo because we haven't had the 14th or 15th Amendment yet. So obviously Black Americans being targeted by groups like the KKK, and there's riots in southern cities in 1866. Also, what happens is in 1865 is Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, becomes president. Andrew Johnson is not a fan of civil rights. He is an obstacle to civil rights, and he tries to slow down any attempts by Congress to bring about legislation to advance civil rights in any way. So we see in 1866, the 1866 Civil Rights Act is passed by Congress despite a veto by Johnson. He tries to veto that. He also tries to veto legislation regarding the Freedmen's Bureau, which is created, which is a kind of welfare organization to provide the freed slaves with housing, education, basic welfare. Johnson's not a fan of that, tries to veto that, but Congress goes against him on that and overrides his veto. 1867, we get the Military Reconstruction Act, which is the start of radical Reconstruction. So the federal government takes control of the southern states, and this is where we start to see a raft of legislation to really impose on the South a new settlement to enforce, Black American civil rights. 1868, we have the 14th Amendment, which is all about citizenship for Black Americans and those who've previously been enslaved. 1869, Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, much more favorable towards civil rights than Andrew Johnson. So Johnson really is a hindrance in those 4 years while he's president. Grant is much less of a hindrance, and actually some legislation passed during Grant's time in office is much more positive. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified, which gives Black American males the right to vote, which is hugely significant. So you end up with 16 black congressmen and 2 black senators and lots of black representatives on a local level between 1869 and 1877, which really emphasizes the significance of the 15th Amendment. 1871, the Enforcement Acts, which are passed against the KKK, which kind of outlaws the KKK, which is emphasizing that it's a good example of the government taking control in the South to enforce kind of these laws on the South to stop the kind of white backlash. Although obviously when you study this, you learn it's not hugely effective. In 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau ends, so that's quite short-lived. It only lasts from 65 to 72, and the Amnesty Act is passed, which gives ex-Confederates the right to hold public office, and this is where we start to see the ex-Confederates, the Southern Democrats, as they become, really start to take back control in the South. In 1873, again, we see that the tide is starting to turn. W.E.B. Du Bois calls Reconstruction the moment in the sun for Black Americans, and 1873 is a turning point, I think. Slaughterhouse cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. The decision there is really about states' rights and upholding states' rights. So you can start to see things changing in terms of the way that the government is approaching these things. There's also a Colfax massacre of Black Americans in Louisiana, which really emphasizes the white backlash and the use of political violence. Similarly, there's an economic depression, and this means lots of white Americans in the North start to turn against the idea of Reconstruction, less willing to support that because of this economic depression. In 1875, the Civil Rights Act is passed, which forbids segregation in public places, and that happens to be overturned later in the century. And then 1866 is the U.S. versus Cruikshank decision. Again, it's about states' rights and hindering the federal government's ability to impose legislation on the southern states. Later on that year, there's the murder of Mississippi State Senator Charles Caldwell, who's Black American, and again showing the use of political violence to kind of uphold white supremacy in the South. 1876 is this contested election between Hayes and Tilden, which leads to the end of Reconstruction. Hayes makes this deal with the Democrats to remove all remaining federal troops to end Reconstruction in 1877. So that's the end of Reconstruction. It's the end of the federal government being in control of the South. However, by the end of Reconstruction, as it says here, 700,000 Black American males had the right to vote. So pretty significant change from, if we start back in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery. Okay, so if we try and, I went through that really quickly, and what I would suggest in terms of revision is breaking down the content into these ways. So talking about motivating factors, what are the things that are driving change in this first period? Really, it's the US government, particularly presidents like Lincoln and Grant, obviously not Andrew Johnson, I'll talk about him in a second, but Congress, and particularly the radical Republicans in Congress from 67 up to the mid-70s are pushing for legislation like the Enforcement Acts and the amendments to give Black Americans more rights. But you've also got Black American Agency. And I had an image at the start of Frederick Douglass, who is a really prominent Black American advocating and fighting for Black American rights. So Black Americans are not just passive here, they are fighting in the war, they are protesting and campaigning for rights. That's another motivating factor which influences kind of legislation as well. And obviously standing for office and holding public office as well. You could talk about the senators and the congressmen in terms of under that banner of Black American Agency. In terms of obstacles, what are the things that are holding back civil rights here? We've got white attitudes, so you could talk about the KKK. You could also talk about the White Leagues, which emerged in 1873, which are called the KKK without the sheets. You could just talk about the high instance of lynching in this period, that white Americans, particularly in the South, are doing all they can to try and maintain white supremacy. And then another obstacle is kind of Northern apathy. You can talk about the end of the Freedmen's Bureau, the economic depression, and the end of Reconstruction being as a result of this kind of Northern apathy, that people in the North, white people in the North, felt like this is, it's gone far enough. We don't want to keep on paying for supporting Reconstruction. Another way to break down the content is really, and we're thinking about civil rights, so really think about social, political, and economic rights. And I've just put some points there that you could put under those categories. There obviously are more examples that you could talk about. But yeah, that's a good way of breaking down the content: social, political, economic. What are the things that affect social rights? What are the things that affect political rights? And what are the things that affect economic rights in this period? Finally, on to past questions. So I'm just going to briefly talk about these and a suggested structure. As I always say, this is not the only way of doing it. There are many ways of doing this, and if you can think of different ways or better ways, that's absolutely fine. So in 2022, the question was, in the years 1865 to 77, it was the violent activities of white supremacist groups that had the most damaging impact on the civil rights of black Americans in the South. How far do you agree with this statement? So this is a kind of obstacles question, obviously starting with the factor in the question, white supremacist groups, and then you could go on to talk about Andrew Johnson and then maybe Northern apathy. So you can see if you break it down as I did before into kind of obstacles, motivating factors, social, political, economic, it really helps you plan your essays. The next question on this that's been in the exam in 2019, how far do you agree it was the federal government reconstruction measures that were the most responsible for improving the lives of black Americans in the years 1865 to 77? So that is a motivating factors question. It's federal government reconstruction measures. But really, there isn't much else that's responsible for improving the lives of black Americans. You could talk about Black American Agency, but I would suggest with this one, a better structure might be to do it social, political, economic, and talk about the things that improved social rights and then political rights and then economic rights. They would be your 3 paragraphs, always starting with federal government reconstruction measures and then mentioning anything else that helped those areas. And then finally, this is from 2017, constitutional amendments introduced during the Reconstruction period significantly improved the position of black Americans in the years 1865 to 77. How far do you agree? I would suggest doing that social, political, economic, and then under each of those kind of headings, how far did the amendments, and I think you can talk about other things as well that were subsequent to those amendments, like the Enforcement Acts, the Civil Rights Acts, those things. You could talk about other Reconstruction legislation, how far those things significantly improved the position of black Americans. So you're kind of weighing up whether those things actually did make significant improvements or not. And I would suggest with that one, social, political, economic would be a good approach. Okay, I hope that was useful. Please, if you've got any questions or comments or need anything clarifying, just leave a comment and I will do my best to answer it. Thanks for listening.